Hello and welcome to SLA Spotlight, the podcast of Stuart Leach Associates, the litigation and disputes communication specialists. I'm Malcolm Munro, a television journalist, and in this series I'll be talking to leaders, thinkers, pioneers in the world of law, of business, sport, media, and much more. Today in the studio we're joined by Simon Oldfield. Welcome, Simon. Simon has built a unique career blending two seemingly different worlds, art and law. Since opening the Simon Oldfield Gallery, he's exhibited the work of many influential artists, discovered new talent and spearheaded collaborations with major institutions and commercial partners. And with his experience as a lawyer, he has also deep dived into the world of digital art, AI, NFTs, blockchain and fintech, you name it. Simon, welcome. Can I begin by asking you just to explain a little bit about your journey and how you've got to where you have got to in the world of art?
Yes, of course. And thanks very much for the very generous introduction. Thank you. It's very nice to be here with you today and having this conversation. I think just already the things we've touched on, I think it's going to be great. So thanks very much for inviting me. So my career, where did it begin? I started as a lawyer and I studied law. And even when I was studying law, I was very interested in this intersection of art, law, and technology. That intersection has always been of interest to me. When I was at university and even looking at doing my dissertations and looking at subjects that could be tackled, at that point, a lot of people were sort of asking me, why is this going to be so significant? And the internet is such a small thing, and it's probably going to be a passing phase. And lots of professors that I was talking to at that time really they sort of didn't really understand the scope of what was about to come. I don't think any of us did. I certainly didn't. But I was looking at these sort of fairly granular issues, maybe like trademarks versus domain names and what that might mean. And so I realized very early on that I was very interested in these sort of the way these things rub up against each other. But alongside that, I loved art and I always wanted to be working probably in the art world. But just because of the course of things, I ended up doing a law degree. I worked with a very good law firm in the city for my training contract, stayed with them for a little while afterwards, but very quickly was drawn into the art world. And even while I was still working at the law firm, I think I could probably safely say this now, I was working at a gallery as well at the weekends. Really, frankly, I loved it. I was thriving in that environment. I learned a lot. I taught myself a lot, and I went to Sotheby's and did courses. And working in galleries allowed me to develop a really deep knowledge of both the art itself, but also the business of art. And marrying that with the law it felt like a really great progression. But at that point, in the early 2000s, it seems like such a long time ago now, I think it wasn't easy to see a way that I could marry the two at that point. So I made a decision that I was going to leave the law completely and then step into the art world. And I think it was a sort of fairly bold decision. I think if I knew what I know now, I may not have done that in such a way, but it worked. With the benefit of hindsight, it did work. I think that the lack of knowledge that I had allowed me to be a little bolder than maybe I otherwise would have been. And so for a few years, I was sort of working with galleries, doing independent projects, working, really just trying to cut my teeth essentially, and still doing a little bit of legal work with a few companies, and really focusing on IP and that sort of the way that IP was becoming an increasingly powerful component to any kind of contract, really.
Well, quite, because I'd very much like to come on to a bit later a whole range of issues,
yes,
which do involve the law around the impact of AI and the impact of intellectual property and all of those things. But just before we get to some of those things, I'm just fascinated because you've immersed yourself in the world of art. Art is often misrepresented, not always understood by everybody. And the whole question, even before AI came along, about what makes art in some cases extremely valuable and in some cases not valuable at all. And it could be a simple matter of authenticity or reputation or rarity or all of these different things. And the question which is sometimes asked by people who are accused, if you like, of being Philistines for even asking the question is it art? Is that something you constantly grapple with?
I work in the contemporary art world, and so that question is often asked and it's often posed, particularly when people are beginning their kind of art collecting journey. They'll ask those sorts of questions. And it is actually interesting because you start to explain why things like, the gaffer tape over the banana makes sense, why the urinal fits into things, what it did, how it changed the course of things, and how we can then see the kind of the threads that bring it through to contemporary art today. And when you're on a journey with somebody and you're beginning to sort of show them and introduce them to different kinds of work, contemporary art world is large, and there's different kinds of work within that, of course. And so it's interesting to see people go on that journey, and as they progress, they start to change their perception of what art might be. They might still always come back to paintings. They want to buy paintings for their collection, but they understand the kind of the broader role of things like, conceptual art and minimal art and things that maybe kind of encourage people to ask that question: what is art and what is the meaning of art, and therefore the value.
And if someone grabs you at a dinner party and asks you why, to use this example for the last time, I promise, the banana gaffer tape to the wall, why that would be valuable, where a banana in Waitrose will cost you 40 pence, do you have an answer for that?
Well, I think so. I mean, look, it's he hasn't just, the artist didn't just take the banana and put it on the wall. He has been working in the art world and producing his practice for a very long time. So it's the culmination of all of that, and all of art history within that kind of banana on the wall. I think actually represents almost a much broader sense of what the value is in contemporary art. So it's not about the component parts. If you broke it down, a painting, what's the value of some oil paint and a canvas? It isn't very much. But if it's a Bridget Riley painting versus another painter that you maybe encountered on a holiday on the South Coast, it's a different question. The actual investment, the value of the component parts is very different from the output.
Yes, and of course, with this example, you have authenticity, you have provenance, you have track record, you have fame. There are lots of elements that you could see would contribute to the value. We're about to enter, and we are entering actually a completely different world now, where art can be generated by artificial intelligence, AI. It can be made, if you like, more exclusive or rarer through things such as blockchain. And these are very complicated issues. And we're already seeing examples of how this is causing legal complexities and moral complexities. How far do you think we have gone down the road so far? Are we just seeing the beginning of AI and its impact on the world of art, or is it pretty well established already what that impact will be?
I think we're absolutely at the beginning. I don't think we have all the answers at all. And I think it does get to the heart of the question around, the value that we place against art. At the moment, we place value and it's built and constructed in various ways, combination of the galleries and the museums and curatorial kind of approach, critics, and the way the market will respond to particular work. So, that value is being created in a particular way. The value is being created in a very different way when we turn our attention to technology. It's not being created by a human or in the way that a human would create artwork. There's no human behind it. So you're stripping away that human emotion, and it's not seeking to connect with another human in the way that an artist might be. So I think it starts to question fundamentally what we consider to be human creativity versus machine creativity. And as we're seeing the development of AI, we're seeing a greater sophistication of the work that is being produced by it. And so ultimately, we're going to start, I think, having two very separate kind of bodies of work. We're going to have human labeled work, let's call it that. Work that is very clearly made by a human, and we reward that in a particular way. We protect it in a particular way. And then you will have other work, maybe a much larger pool of computer generated or machine generated or AI generated work. And that work will have been created differently. It might be almost indistinguishable between the two, but it will be valued differently, and it will be protected, maybe not protected at all, but it will ultimately shift the way the market operates, I think.
Okay, before I move on to some of the concerns that people might have around AI-generated art, not produced by the hand of a human being, for example, before we do that, let's look at the other side of the coin. Are you, as someone who's immersed in the art world, excited by the possibilities of art generated by AI?
It's a very good question. I'm excited by technology generally because I think that what it does is challenge the way that we perceive the world, and it can help us navigate the world, and it can almost augment us as humans. It can help us do a lot more efficiently. That said, it is terrifying in many ways about the pace of change and what is coming to us. I don't think people even fully understand the way that it is going to change our world, nor even how it really works. I mean, even the AI experts and the people who build these models don't really understand fully how it works. And I've been having conversations with people recently where we're talking about copyright. I mean, we're going to come on to it, but just as an example, they think about it in the way that how we currently interact with our laptops, for example. They want to know, well, if I'm a creative, I want to know whether my work has been absorbed and ingested by that AI model. And they sort of want to be able to open it up somehow and see it in there. But it doesn't work like that. It's not like on our laptop where you open it up and you have all your files all organized, and you might have a folder, for argument's sake, just says pictures, and you go in there and all the pictures are in there and you can see them and you can find the one that you might be looking for. It just simply doesn't work like that. It's a much more complicated model. The mathematical systems in there are so deeply complex. I'm not a mathematician, so I'm not going to pretend I even understand it, but what I do understand is that it is not organized in that way, and it's not structured in that way. So it's not something you can go in and sort of put in a search term and try and find it. Nor is it necessarily replicated in the way that it might be on our laptop. It's not a sort of a direct copy necessarily. It might just be a fragment, a reference, a code that somehow connects it in a much more complex way. So I think it changes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, okay, looking at that without getting too technical, because very few people would really understand how it works. But what we do know is that AI draws on the huge bank, not just of information, but of creativity, of input from a whole variety of different sources. It draws on, in some ways, the sum of human knowledge and creativity. And on drawing on that, almost by its own volition, does that concern you both morally, that it's right to do that, and ethically as well? The two are very closely related.
Yes, I think it's hugely concerning. I mean, and it's also the pace at which it is absorbing, as you put it. It's almost everything, everything we've created, our heritage. It's been absorbed at such a pace. Everything essentially that has been put on the internet, you could argue one way or another, has been absorbed already by many of these models, or is in the process of being absorbed. And if we have spent the last 30, 40 years putting almost everything that is the sum of humanity onto the internet one way or another, whether it's through text, through images, through research, then we are transferring all of that knowledge to another body. And if the governments get their way and there is a sort of, in the worst case scenario, there's just a broad exemption allowing a sort of free pass to these AI models to absorb all of that, you could almost look at it as the greatest cultural heist in ever, really. At such a pace. I mean, we're discussing things at the moment about things that are held in museums like the British Museum and other museums around the world that maybe have been acquired or brought back to those museums or taken, however you want to put it, at a time when maybe people were going out, they were exploring, they were finding these artifacts and either paying very little or unfair bargains and bringing them back to the UK and putting them into other countries and putting them in these museums. There are some comparisons there. We're now talking about, should these things be returned to those countries, to return to those where to return the kind of cultural heritage to those places. And we are sitting here debating that while there's this other huge machine essentially that is absorbing everything that we have ever created.
Okay, you've raised some interesting issues there around, for example, who owns the ownership of art and how you attach value to certain types of AI-generated art. But there's also perhaps a more concerning element, which is, artists over centuries have suffered for their art. They put themselves hugely into their art, and it's part of their humanity. Do you see a time where perhaps AI, forget for a moment issues around value, copyright, just stripping away humanity from the world of art?
It seems almost inconceivable, doesn't it? Because what makes us feel human is the way that we connect with other humans and the way that we are able to understand them through different languages, whether that's written or visual. I mean, when we discover a cave painting that dates back, another 1,000 years earlier than we first thought we could, we're excited. We feel like there's that connection through time with humanity, and it's visual or it's a small marking. It's that trace of humanity. And I think to sever that, I think it'd be, as a species, I can't imagine how that would feel. I'm actually feeling kind of goosebumpy even talking about it. It's like your family. If you were severed from, we feel this connection, we find back, we discover our family going way back and we find their roots, and maybe we discover that along the way someone had a lot of money and then lost it, or one of our great grandmother had a terrible life and we didn't really know about it, or had some great misfortune, or was brought up in terrible poverty. That somehow hurts us now, doesn't it? And we discover these things and we respond to them very viscerally. And I think culture allows us to talk about that on a broader sense, as a species, rather than just in our own individual lives and family existences. So I do think it is potentially one of the most traumatizing events that could happen to us as a species.
Okay, well, we still have a situation where the world of art will have to live and operate within some of the issues that you're talking about. You're a curator. You're also working dealing with art and all aspects of art. The world of art is trying to respond to some of these challenges, isn't it, by establishing ways where value can still be recognized and value can still be attached. And one of the ways that that's already happened is with what people call NFTs, non-fungible tokens, which is, as I understand it, capturing digital art in some way and making it more exclusive or limiting the access to it through blockchain and through technology. Therefore, it creates a value because of its scarcity. Is that a world that you sometimes operate in? Tell me a bit about that.
I think it offered great promise, and I think that it could have been used as a great tool within the art world. I think the art world perhaps it was too quick to reject it as a concept. And I think it's important for our listeners to maybe help understand what an NFT is versus the art itself. The NFT is a piece of technology. It's a piece of code, essentially, that exists on a blockchain. It's a non-fungible token that can be attached to art or other things. So as a piece of technology itself, it is very useful, and I think it will continue to be useful. It doesn't necessarily have to be in this sphere of art. It can be in many other places, and it already is being used. NFTs are being used in other areas, and there's a smart contract that is sort of kind of underpins the NFT, and that smart contract probably needs to be a bit smarter than they actually are at the moment, but that smart contract allows certain automated functions to take place is the easiest way of thinking about it. But alongside that, with NFTs and art, digital art, you might have attached a piece of digital art to it, and then alongside that you would have a bundle of IP rights, and often those would be off-chain, and those were the things that you really were acquiring. You don't acquire the NFT, which would have this sort of bundle of rights, IP rights attached to it for how you could own and use this piece of digital art, but it could also have been attached to a piece of physical art or something else, a watch or a car or anything else. And so it could, and it still can, have a great use. But there was a skepticism, I think, because it was attached to work that maybe the traditional art world didn't value in the same way, and also was possibly a challenge to their role as the sort of gatekeepers of the art world.
But as someone who lives and works in that world, Have you yourself been involved in, I'm not sure this is the right word, but the trading or the exchange of NFTs? Are you involved in that market at all?
And I mean, the market it went up massively, and then it's dipped, and it has come back a little bit now. Actually, more recently, some of the better examples of NFT art have definitely kind of sustained their value, and that's been great. And I have got clients who have acquired NFTs, and I know many collectors who did at the time and continue to. And I have bought a couple as well. And I think they're interesting as almost a piece of art history. We're talking about the banana and the gaffer tape. It's another example of that. If you buy certain examples of it, it's part of that kind of art historical context. Whether they prove the test of time, I'm not sure, because there's lots of other computer generated work that goes way back to the 70s, which is also very interesting, by some fantastic artists who continue to work today. And then they started to be exploring the idea of NFTs, because it allowed them to sort of sell their work with an NFT attached to it, which did deliver value for them. But so digital artists have been selling work for a very long time. It didn't just start with NFTs. NFTs provided a mechanism for them to sort of, I suppose, create a market and to sell them. However, I think the promise was there didn't quite deliver, partly because the big promise was about royalties and the ability for artists to earn royalties at each subsequent sale of that artwork or that NFT. But the reality was that the smart contract attached to the NFT didn't actually contain the code that allowed for the automatic payment of that royalty.
Right.
Those royalty provisions were kept in off-chain terms and conditions, in a way that you'd have it, any other contract, a kind of real-life contract, paper-based contract. And so people really discovered, I highlighted this at a few conferences, and probably not to everyone's delight. And then I think what happened is people were able to discover that the NFT itself could be transacted without triggering the royalty if the platform upon which the NFT was traded didn't honor the kind of the contractual off-chain contractual terms for the royalty to be paid.
Yeah, and this brings us on, if you like, to a related issue, which is the unfair exchange, if you like, the creator compensation, as you say, the royalties or the rewards from work, to use the technical term, scraped or absorbed from this huge sum of creative data that AI feeds on. How big an issue do you think that is? That the creativity which is perhaps been captured by AI is in some way rewarded. Is that impossible? Is there a way of doing it? Is it happening?
It goes to the heart of the issue, really, and is exactly what's being discussed at the moment by many people. There are consultations going on across the world, and there are court cases fighting out these very issues, because it does. Let's take one example. What the potential scenario could be, where you have this perverse situation where the output is maybe somehow protected under UK copyright law or any other copyright provisions in any country, but the underlying work upon which it has, at least to some extent, kind of been trained, it may not be a direct copy, but somewhat benefited from that underlying copyrighted work. That underlying copyright holder may not have been compensated at all, or may not have ever even consented to their work being used in that way. So you end up with this scenario where there is value being created with the output, but the underlying copyright holder or rights holder is not being compensated. So we do need to find a way, I think, that does reward those who create works that would otherwise be subject to a license or a royalty of some kind. And that is exactly what's being looked at the moment. I mean, the idea was being presented by the EU's taken this approach, and the last government took this approach here, that we would just give a blanket exemption to AI companies, allowing them to sort of train their data on anything that's currently on the internet, and really give a free pass to them to sort of absorb all of this copyrighted material. I think that is probably not the way forward, and I'm pleased that there was so much resistance to that concept from many prominent people within the creative industries. It goes way beyond visual arts. People, musicians and actors, various other, everyone who's involved in creating any kind of work is going to be interested in this, to make sure that their endeavour, their creative work, is protected and that they receive fair compensation for that.
Can you tell me what kind of possibilities are being explored to even identify where there is, creative input, and how do you protect it or attach some kind of value to it in some way, and ensure that that is then delivered and activated to the originator of the creative work. Are there mechanisms in existence that could do that?
Short answer is there probably aren't mechanisms in existence to do that, but there are many options being explored. I think currently what is being explored in the UK, and it is similar to what's happening in the EU, is that the proposal is that there will be a sort of exemption, so they can take this copyrighted work unless the copyright holder opts out, and they have to use some kind of machine readable code that allows the AI to understand that that rights holder has opted out and doesn't want their work to be part of the training model.
Right.
The reality, and alongside that is transparency. You have to have transparency for artists and right holders to actually understand whether their work has been absorbed, and whether their intentions and their wishes are being honoured. The problem lies in the fact that the AI models, like I explained earlier, they're not organised in the way that we maybe would like them to be organised. There's not a way you can sort of open it up and find an image or a work or anything really in that kind of linear way. And so the desire for transparency, which is what the UK consultation is asking for, and the EU Act, the AI Act in the EU is demanding, is transparency. The question is it feasible? Can it be achieved? And then even if it is achieved and we can see what has been absorbed, and then we'll be going forward, be able to understand what will be absorbed, how enforceable is it? And are we able to truly track that? So I think there's a lot of pushback at the moment that the government is not yet, here at least, is not really honouring the interests of the creative industries as well as it should.
Yes, and of course you've talked about what's things that might happen in the UK or might happen in the European Union, but we do live in a globalised world, particularly when it comes to AI and the internet generally. So with the sheer volume that will grow exponentially in the coming years, is any potential way of rewarding, recompensing, or giving royalties to creators, will it just be lost in the sheer volume of material that will be available?
Of course, there's a risk that will be the case, but I hope that isn't the outcome. One way you could look at it is that what has already been absorbed has been absorbed. Could there be an approach where there is a sort of a settlement for everything that has already come to pass? Somehow we'd have to work out how that'd be distributed. And I think that'd be very complex. And I think the AI companies would then push back and say, well, that would basically bankrupt us and it would thwart development and progress. So that probably, the figure that would be necessary might not be feasible. So I don't know whether that would really work. But if you could try and work out a mechanism that at least looks at, this is the line in the stand that we have now, and then we look forward for creating a way to allow creatives to easily opt out. Because the other criticism is that if at the moment you don't have to do very much in the UK to you create a work, and providing it meets the criteria, it has copyright protection. You don't have to take another step. And if the opt-out sort of model is introduced and adopted here, then creatives will then have to take that extra step, and the burden is on them to do so, and then to police it, and then to enforce it through the courts. The US, you talk about the global approach, the US is taking a slightly different approach. They're not introducing lots of regulation. They're not really looking at how, the EU has got a kind of comprehensive approach to it, and they're trying to create they've introduced the AI Act, which demands transparency and it doesn't directly deal with copyright, but it will do eventually, I'm sure. And here we're sort of taking a somewhat in-between position, but the US is leaving it to the courts. So you have all these things going through the courts challenging the concept of copyright and how it can be enforced. And many of the arguments being put forward in the courts is that it's fair use. They can absorb this work, and it's fair use. I think we can probably go into a couple of cases, if you like, in the US that might challenge that concept. But in the UK, we're also having courts examine some of these issues. So here we have Stability AI which is the Getty Images case, which is going through the High Court. We haven't yet got the outcome of that. But if we just look at that, that might help us understand some of the issues that we're grappling with. However, Stability AI challenged some of the arguments, obviously, that Getty were putting forward and advancing. And so they withdrew one of their key arguments, which was primary infringement. And so they're now relying on secondary infringement. And this is important. It's interesting because the primary infringement element was that they felt that Getty decided that they would withdraw that argument because they clearly felt they couldn't advance that argument sufficiently because, as Stability AI argued, that the work was trained, their model was trained on the material outside of the UK. And so therefore they couldn't find jurisdiction, essentially, a sufficient connection in the UK. And they had to rely on secondary infringement, and their argument is that there's essentially it's been imported into the UK and the model itself is the artifact. So you have two interesting points here. We don't want to get too technical, but first of all is there's the international component, and copyright law in the UK is territorial. And secondly, you have to, is it going to be possible to see the model as a sort of as an artifact, as a thing that can itself infringe because it's importing all that infringing work?
And are we talking here about Getty Images, like photographic images, principally? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And so there's a trademark component as well because there's a Getty Images that they felt they could see. I mean, some of them you really can see the traces of these Getty Images, and even some of them the watermark, the trace of the Getty watermark. And so there's a trademark element here as well, which is, I won't go down that tangent, but it's an interesting point from trademark. The bigger picture is copyright, but trademark is an element. But it does speak to this idea that if you know, it's a global system, and then interestingly, the AI companies then suddenly want it to be global, but when it suits, they will focus on this sort of territorial concept of copyright.
And of course, they have deep pockets, and litigation is a fairly expensive game.
Yeah.
Not even fairly expensive. So clearly, large owners of art, or successful established artists, might have the wherewithal, if you like, to pursue that legally, or to contact someone like yourself to help them. But an ordinary poet, artist, musician making their way in the world isn't going to be able to protect that, are they?
No, exactly. And so one of the things that's been looked at the moment is combined with this drive for transparency, which is essential if we're really going to protect artists or creatives in any real sense. Alongside there's the opt-out, and then that allows there to be a licensing regime. And the licensing regime could be direct licensing if the artist is prominent enough and has the resources to negotiate and issue a license and enter into a license with an AI company. But then there are many, as you touch on, that won't have that or won't be able to. So there's we already have the concept of collective licensing. So there are organizations that are already looking at this as a concept to try and create some kind of collective license for groups of artists, groups of creatives to be able to license, en masse essentially to the AI companies.
Well, that's encouraging that there are steps. Time will tell how successful they are to make sure that artists and creativity is in some way rewarded. Let's finish on a slightly sort of more aesthetic, higher level, if you like, around the principle of creating art. Established artists like Hockney, exhibited fairly recently, well known, and they've worked their way through essentially by putting a paintbrush on canvas. Anyone now can go on to AI and say, I'd like you to create this image. Can you do it in the style of Hockney? And they end up with something. Does that devalue everything?
Well, if it's very close to Hockney, it might well be copyright infringement. But aside from that, yes, I mean, possibly. I think it probably does, because you could imagine the world, where there's a huge volume of art that's being created by either AI assisted or AI generated entirely that, has a market of its own. It may not have copyright attached to it because, each country is trying to assert that copyright protection should only be afforded to humans, essentially, for creative human endeavor. But that doesn't necessarily mean there is no market for these other works over here, and someone might just pay a fee to produce that work. It may or may not be infringing. Putting that aside, yes, I think it does, and of course it devalues to some extent. Maybe not the entire market, but a chunk of the market. I could imagine a world where, the art world at its the top of the art world, there is it's a limited group of artists and collectors and galleries in any case. So will it affect that? I'm not sure. Maybe that will just become a even more rarefied world. But it might affect the kind of under the bonnet. There's a huge number of artists and creatives who produce brilliant work every day, but they might be a more commercial. They might commercial artists,
and they may argue that there is a collaborative process where they ask, for the want of a better word, AI to produce an image, and then they say, well, I want to adapt that and change that, the palettes or the color or the style. I want to do this, I want to do that, and AI will respond and deliver what they're asking for. And what that means is that there is still a creative process.
There is, and that's sort of largely grouped into sort of AI-assisted creation. And in those scenarios, if the prompter, the person who's working with the AI, treats it as a tool, then that would probably attract copyright and be and the person who's helped create that, because I mean most of the AI models actually say that the person who is using the model, it to create something, will be the owner of the output. And so if they're the owner of the output and they're the author of it, they are the creator, they're prompting it, they're almost like a producer for a movie or something, then there would probably be copyright attached to it. But I can imagine a world where you have almost this sort of label, as I said, like human made, but it's almost like the kind of the verified world of couture fashion or organic food. It might work for some people, but most people might just take the kind of easier, cheaper route, and that will obviously shift the market and values completely, and then it might start shifting the way that we can find remedies for compensating infringements and that sort of thing, because if the ultimate market value drops, then the damages might drop. There's an interesting case that took place in the US, which I've just touched on briefly, which wasn't directly related to AI. It was a case by Lynn Goldsmith, who's a photographer, against the Andy Warhol Foundation. And it was looking at this particular matter around licensing, because Lynn Goldsmith had taken a photograph of Prince, the singer, and that had been licensed to Vanity Fair way back in the early 80s, was then licensed to Warhol, and Warhol produced a whole series of artworks. One of those was used within Vanity Fair to illustrate an article about Prince when his Purple Rain fame. When he died in 2016, Vanity Fair, Condé Nast, wanted to produce another commemorative issue of a magazine for Prince's life, and they contacted the Warhol Foundation. They said, can we use one of those paintings, or can we use the painting again for another license? And they said, actually, why don't you use a different one? We got a few in a different colorway, as he often produced multiple different colorways of the same image. And they chose Orange Prince, which is a different edition. So Lynn Goldsmith then discovers this usage, and she argues that it is an infringement on her rights. It ultimately worked all its way up to the Supreme Court, and they decided, in the end, in her favour on a very narrow issue of licensing, on the fair use doctrine in the US. And ultimately, the decision was on the fourth plank, without wanting to get too technical, of fair use, and that was looking at market competitiveness, essentially. So was the image by Warhol competing with the photograph of Lynn Goldsmith for the same kind of thing? And they decided that essentially, yes.
So, as is often the case in law, it wasn't so much a question of ethics or morals or plagiarism, it was simply a technical licensing point.
Well, you say that, yes, sure. However, there is speculation that in the back of their minds, when they arrived at this point, they were thinking about the interests of artists. Of course, Warhol is also an artist, but let's say they're just thinking of the interest of artists in the age of AI. So they were essentially saying that there is a license on scenario. Artists or anyone needs to have a license to use someone else's work. So I think that there is that case will be very useful for creatives who are challenging AI models in the future in the US, possibly even not here because it won't have the, but it could be it could influence a decision and argue, support an argument. But in the US, I think it will have some strength to be able to support artists in saying that case said that you needed a license. We are essentially competing in the same marketplace, and therefore it's a breach of my rights, and it doesn't come under the fair use doctrine.
Interesting. Okay, let's finish, forgive the pun, big picture. We've been through a lot of technology, a lot of law and technicalities, and some really interesting issues raised by AI. You've said that really we're just at the tip of the iceberg, and what will come in the future, who knows? But how optimistic are you that within the new AI world, there will still be a place for original art, there will still be a place for creativity, and there will still be a reward to those who are creative?
Yes, I do remain optimistic. I think we have to. But I think we have to shift the way we think about things. I think we think about things in silos still. We're talking about copyright, and that's been a big issue that's been in the press, and how the AI interacts with that. And that's a siloed issue. AI doesn't think in that way. It doesn't operate in that way. It's this, we have to think of it as a one enormous body. If you take, for example, something like, the Great Plague of London, if we look back at that and we start thinking about how that might be documented in a textbook, it might look at the kind of the medical, it might look at the political, the social, and any work that came out of it, poetry, art, whatever. And so it's sort of multifaceted. That's how we need to start thinking about AI. It's multifaceted. So we can deal with these individual siloed issues, but we need to think like it operates. We need to think, I believe, as one human species, as humanity, and we shouldn't be scared of thinking of ourselves as humanity versus AI, not necessarily in a combative way, but in a way that allows us to collectively deal with this, because that's what it's doing. It is this collective mega mind, is the way you might want to think of it. And that's how we need to start to consider things. And then if we do, we'll value the outputs even more, I think.
Well, on that optimistic and philosophical note, Simon Oldfield, curator, dealer, lawyer, thanks for joining us on SLA Spotlight.
Thank you.